of all, just to deal with some overarching myths, I think for those of you who are not experienced or have not been part of any of those communities, there is no unified community. There's this broad umbrella that has attempted to capture what we in the United States have called sometimes sexual minorities. But even that term doesn't quite describe the issue. And one of the concerns, one of the issues we'll be dealing with tonight are how we deal with recovery and treatment as gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer individuals, or how we deal with those people from those communities and those individuals as unique persons in our work, whatever our work may be. One of the things we need to distinguish, is that anything I say tonight will not be true for everyone. It cannot be true for everyone. And when I refer to any research or any data, please be aware that mostly that research has been done because of the way research is structured, particularly in the United Kingdom. And I'm now a citizen as of last Thursday, so I'm not criticizing it. But it's a problem with research generally. And that problem being that the people who get studied when we do studies tend to be the people who are willing to fill out questionnaires or be interviewed. So, whatever statistical maneuvers we may engage in, we're getting people to talk to us or to answer questionnaires who are willing to do that. So we're losing a whole lot of people who aren't. Does that make sense? The other thing is the more urban the setting in which the research is done, the less it's going to have applicability to more rural or less urban settings. One of the critiques of almost all research with these communities that we're here to talk about tonight is that what you're finding out is about troubled people who are willing to talk about it. And so people can misuse the research, all sorts of research, and misinterpret it to the public mind so that it appears that all gays are alcoholics and all lesbians are in troubled relationships and they all move in with each other after the first date, and there are all sorts of things that people get in the common mind that simply are not true, although they may be joked about to some degree or another in the gay community, the lesbian community, the bisexual community, transgendered and queer communities. How many of you read the Evening Standard? How many of you ever pick one up just kind of by mistake? How many of you saw this yesterday? You can't see what I'm saying. Sadness of a bigoted tirade. A drugs advisor to the government, Dr. Hans Christian Raby, is outspoken about the harms associated with what he calls the homosexual lifestyle. Have you all heard of that? A high proportion of homosexual men engage in a destructive lifestyle, for example, contracting HIV/AIDS or other STIs, and develop addictions to drugs or alcohol. There is a higher burden of depression and attempted or completed suicide among the gay population, says Dr. Raby. Is it something about homosexuality itself that predisposes homosexuals to substance abuse, depression and suicidal ideation? Or is it the pronouncements of people like Dr. Raby that get them down? That was Evening Standard's comment. I thought that was rather telling. I looked him up on the internet this morning. He also had there was a piece on him in The Guardian yesterday with similar tripe. You all know what tripe is? This is a perfect example of the willingness to demonize outside groups with which we're not familiar and to blame victimhood on them, rather than to look at all of the factors that go into it. Now, how many of you think someone becomes an alcoholic because they're born in an alcoholic family? Does anyone who's not born in an alcoholic family become an alcoholic? Yeah. Okay. So not everyone who's alcoholic is born into an alcoholic family. Does everyone who has an addiction problem, whether it's a drug addiction, an alcohol addiction, other drug addiction, or what we call process addictions, a sex addiction, etc., overeating, debting, those sorts of things. Does that have a genetic component to it necessarily, or do we know? We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. We don't know. Do drugs cause people to be gay or lesbian?
No.
Or bisexual? No. Are there gays, lesbians, transgendered individuals, and bisexuals and queers who never touched a drug, aren't interested in being drunk, but may drink socially?
Sure.
Yes, of course. So when we talk about this, we have to be careful we have to be careful to avoid any hint of demonization of the population, or these populations. Because in fact, each person who's affected by drugs, alcohol, or process addiction is a unique individual with his or her own unique history. Now, what members of these sexual minority communities bring to the table that may be a contributing factor is that many, although not all anymore, but many have suffered trauma as children. Many suffer trauma as children or adolescents over their known or suspected sexual orientation. Does that make sense to you? Many experience religious abuse, unwittingly perhaps, by their parents or their religious community, for the way in which the community talked about homos, or queers, or weird women who dress like men. One of my earliest memories, I was about 3.5 years old, and I became friends with these two men that lived next door to my grandmother. And they always were in the nicest suits. And one day, I heard my father say to my grandmother, "So are those women who dress like men still living next door to you?" So I marched next door the next chance I got, and I knocked on their door and I said, "My father said you're women who dress like men. Can you tell me about that?" And they were quite embarrassed and said, "Oh, it's beyond you," and all that stuff. And this was in 1952. Now, as I got older and they were still living there, it became very clear to me that they were a lovely lesbian couple, and they kept to themselves, but they lived in a very, almost exclusively evangelical Christian neighborhood. There was a Christian college a block and a half up the hill. So it was, how they survived it, I cannot imagine. But they were this really nice couple, and they used to bake lemon cookies for me when I would come to visit my grandmother, and they'd bring them over. And she would not talk to them, but she would let me take them home. So religious abuse happens in a variety of ways as well. There are a whole host of risk factors for drug use and for alcohol use and for addiction. Would you agree? What are some of those common ones to pretty much everybody?
Abuse.
Abuse. Childhood trauma, abuse, possibly genetic predisposition in some instances. Anything else?
Self-loathing. Self-loathing.
Self-loathing. In the case of members of sexual minority communities, internalized phobia about oneself, self-doubt, insecurity, feeling less than belong.
Not being accepted.
Not being accepted. Lack of confidence.
Loneliness, isolation.
Loneliness and isolation. This doesn't always happen all at once, so it's a process over time. What we do know, and because I've worked with kids as well, with adolescents off the streets in Los Angeles, who were struggling with these issues at a program that no longer exists called Gay and Lesbian Adolescent Social Services. We help get the kids into housing and counseling and back into school and eventually, hopefully, reunification with families if that were possible. But one of the things was that this horrible sense of despair that things would never get better. You're 16 and you're out on the street. And what do you do if you're 16 and out on the street and a male or a female and gay, for example? How do you support yourself?
Make so your body.
You may sell your body and become a hooker at a very young age. And in fact, about 45% of our clients had some experience with that, of exploitation. The damage that's done means that people seek relief from that pain, and they seek it in alcohol, drugs, and social acceptance. And it's not the only way that they seek it, but it's often the first line of defense because it's readily available in almost any urban center. Now, as we move into an older age group, in the 20s and 30s, what we see, and I will speak right now mainly from my experience as a gay man, what we will see is that the gay social structure the scene, as it were, for example, in London, depending on what groups you're associated with, there are differing levels of acceptance of certain kinds of drug use. Alcohol use is almost ubiquitous, and some people abuse it and some people don't. Some people drink quite responsibly and don't have a problem. But on the gay club scene, there's a great deal of heavy drug use. And increasingly, unfortunately, and I imagine you're seeing this, methamphetamine, crystal meth, is becoming more and more available. Partly as cocaine and MDMA or ecstasy have become less and less available. I saw this in the mid to late 90s in the US, in particular in the early 2000s, early now-teens. Crystal meth, have any of you experienced working with clients with crystal meth, who had crystal meth addiction? Anyone? Or knew people who did? It's particularly devastating unless you're very wealthy. And then it's particularly devastating that you're usually able to avoid exposure or avoid it interfering with your life. So drugs are often used, all drugs are often used to socially lubricate sexual encounters. They make it easier for people who may feel inhibited, but who feel a need to connect in some way. And we can judge, we can be moralistic and judge whether or not those sexual encounters are appropriate or inappropriate. But that's not my position. I'm not the judge. I'm there to deal with the after effects and hopefully with prevention. But people often seeking sexual encounter are really seeking some kind of connection and connectedness. And it's also true that gay men, most of us, are men, and we have sex drives. And lesbian women, I don't know many lesbian men, but lesbians have a different kind of sex drive, but it's theirs, and they have a right to it. And they experience it. It's just like women have a different sex drive in general to men. Would you agree? I mean, the notion of the experience of it subjectively is different. The drive itself is different. So, not all gay men are promiscuous, but many of us are. Whatever promiscuous means. And you will find 1,000 definitions. I shocked someone once when I told them how many sexual encounters I estimated I'd had in my life. This is about 20 years ago. And I've stopped doing it ever since because I thought she was going to faint. Because when you interview non-gay men or non-bisexual men, you'll often hear, well, I've had 40 partners in my life, or maybe 60. I've had that many in a week, or probably not a week, 2 weeks on holiday, depending on how you define sexual partner. So, what do we mean by sex? What is a sexual encounter? I'm not going to answer that question, but I want you to think about it. What is a sexual encounter? For some people, a sexual encounter is only full-on some kind of intercourse, insertive intercourse. Other people can spend hours just engaging in touching and feeling and feel quite satisfied and believe that that's a sexual encounter. So I leave it to you to consider what is sex. But figure that on average, gay men have a lot more sex than most of their straight counterparts. That's got well documented in research as well as empirical experience, unfortunately. That doesn't mean we're proud of it, or that any of us should be proud of it. It doesn't mean we should be ashamed of it. It's just a fact. So, what we do is we have an expectation in the gay community of having friends and of socializing in some way. And so when you get people socializing, people tend to adopt ways and means of socializing that their peers are using to socialize. Would you agree? So, if I go to Fire, which is a gay club in Vauxhall, and I go to an after-hours club called Beyond, chances are almost everyone in there is going to be off his space, whether he's straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or just queer, or straight. They're going to be most of those people are going to be off their face on some kind of chemical, in addition to booze, in addition to alcohol, because that's part of that social setting. The fallout from that for us is that it tends to increase over time for most people. Some people manage it, so they do it just on weekends once a month. But many of the people we will see in our practices or our clinics or our programs will be people who experience this development of tolerance and the increasing use. Now, I think it's ridiculous to blame it on the gay social scene or the homosexual lifestyle, because you have a number of non-gay people who do the club scene all over London who get into the same kind of issues and same kinds of problems. But understanding and working with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, who am I leaving out, queer people, you have to take into account their sexual orientation. You have to take into account their unique experiences that are going to be different to the mainstream of culture. They are just going to be different. So, social lubrication, seeking acceptance. You see, I can go and be very uncomfortable in a club scene. You know, you can imagine me at this club called Beyond. I'm 60 years old. You know, I'm probably going to fit in. I'm like, well, I mean, I could go, like many people would do, but imagine the discomfort that someone would feel if they've really not been exposed to this before. So someone, not intending to get them hooked, comes along and says, hey, why don't you do a bump of this? Do you all know what a bump is? A bump is like, my understanding of it, it's a little bullet-shaped tube with a plastic caulk on it, and you open it up and you put in whatever you're taking, which in my experience is usually MDMA or cocaine or ketamine or methamphetamine, crystal meth. Because it's easier to do this than to smoke a meth pipe in a club where you might get more likely to be seen. So what people do is they'll try it and they feel better almost instantly. And suddenly they're more verbal and they're more able to relax and have a good time, and they're able to socialize in a way that they might not have been, and they might have been terrified of doing before. Why would they be terrified? Well, if they're young and they're from, I don't know, Rotherham, they may have rather limited social experience in a gay setting. This helps them feel more comfortable, and after all, this new person they met offered it to them. And the person offering it to them didn't offer it to him or her in order to get them hooked on something. They just offered it to them to be friendly. So it allows that new young person to feel more at ease in the social circumstance. This is also true of alcohol use. Now, I have to tell you, by American standards, which I'm still trying to shake off for you, almost every person in Britain is an alcoholic. But by British standards and continental standards, that's simply not true. And I've had to come to terms with this in some very interesting ways, and I'm still sorting it out. That there are people who have livers the size of Wembley Stadium, but they aren't alcoholic. I'm getting there, okay? It happens and I'm getting there. But the point is that people use alcohol to socially lubricate as well. And there's a great deal of marketing that's targeted towards gay men right now. Are you aware of this? Of alcohol adverts in gay publications. You don't see MDMA and ketamine and crystal meth advertised yet, but you do see alcohol advertised quite heavily. So I should have brought some of the giveaway handout publications probably just to show you. There'll be pages, there'll be big events sponsored by this lager company or that cider firm or whatever. And there's a real push to sell alcohol because there are a lot of gay people. In London has a huge population of gay men, for example, and a huge population compared to most other cities in the country and indeed the world of lesbians. And I'm sure double that of bisexuals. Lots of bisexuals who work and go into both scenes. So alcohol is almost always a given in any gay social setting, unless it's a sober setting. This is going to be true not just in Britain, this is true anywhere in the world, but there's very definitely a push of advertising, lots of adverts, towards the gay community to sell alcohol. It's a big moneymaker. It's a big moneymaker. If you don't believe me, visit a gay club with me sometime. I'll take you if you want to go on a field trip. And you can see how shocking it is that they will run out of something like beer because it's a bigger weekend than they expected, and they actually run out. And they will have staff going out to the local or far and near corner shop off license to buy more to bring in, because some clubs actually, I've seen them run out of beer when I've been there with friends on a weekend. Shocking. But there's such a push for it. And one of the pushes is 2-for-1 specials sometimes, buy one, get one free. Happy hour extends till 9 p.m., so come early and get it half price. There are all sorts of marketing tools that are used. But the purpose of it is that it makes people feel more relaxed and more comfortable. What's the other use of drugs and alcohol, do you think, that might affect this community, besides making it easier to socialize and maybe feel more comfortable? It's a sexual disinhibitor. So it makes it easier to have sex. And unfortunately, depending on the drug, sometimes it makes it easier to have unsafe sex. But not always. A lot of people I know and have treated do not have unsafe sex, but they have used drugs. And they've still been able to keep it safe. Well, safer, as we say. So it does enable, though, the connecting for sexual encounters in a way that people who are very shy might not otherwise connect. What else does it do? Alcohol and drugs. What do they do? How do they serve the gay community? Or not serve it? The lesbian community, bisexual community, the LGBTQ community. We're self-medicating against pain, usually, or against depression. One of the problems with some of these drugs, like crystal meth in particular, is the depression that occurs when you stop using it at the end of a run. You've been awake for 4 days. I've seen people awake for 9. And they're hallucinating, and they're jittery, and they're picking at their skin all the time. Have you seen that yet? Yeah, bugs crawling under their skin. That's with really pretty severe, hardcore, longer-term use that you see that. You don't usually see the people that have just started using. But one of the peculiar things about many of these drugs, cocaine, MDMA, crystal methamphetamine, do you all know what MDMA is? It's disputed over here. In the US, we also call it ecstasy because it's basically the same chemical formulation, but here people disagree with that, so I don't need to get into the fight. Basically, they're very similar anyway. And all of these are sexually enhancing of libido and of excitement and of the desire. However, what's the undesired side effect of most? Not always and not for everyone, but for the overwhelming majority of men, they're unable to sustain, either to acquire, maintain, or sustain an erection after use. So that's true for most of the stimulants. So while the desire is there, they can be very frustrating. Now, there are cocktails. We get into this difficult part. So then people learn from their friends that they can make a cocktail of drugs. So they take Viagra with their crystal meth, and they may take a very high dose of it. And what does this enable them to do if they're sexually excited? They can maintain their erection, at least periodically. So we have people that are just like any other addicts, really, ignoring their sexual orientation, but who, because of their circumstances, are using the drugs or got into the habit or the process of using the drugs or alcohol or whatever in order to perform sexually so that they can be disinhibited, so that they can make connections with people, so they can do something to express what they think their nature is. How old were you when you had your first thoughts about being gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or queer? Is that a question most of you would ask at intake? Probably not. How old were you when you first acted on those thoughts? Describe your first sexual experiences. These might or may not be the same as your first acting on them. When was your first sexual experience with an adult? Who were you out to? Friends, family, work, or anyone, or no one? How do you feel about being gay, or lesbian, or transgender, or bisexual, or queer? And finally, and this is often a shocker, if you could change your sexual orientation, would you want to do so? Why the last question?
Get to the shame.
Did you say that louder?
To get to the shame.
To get to the shame. Why would someone who is a member of one of those communities feel shame? I'm out and I'm proud. Where does the shame come from? It's the shame that comes from others, basically, that's being imposed, or that's been absorbed, unwittingly, unintentionally absorbed. And what is the role that shame plays generally for all people in addictions? We're rolling in it. If we're addicts, we've been rolling in shame for a long time. And we often, as part of our treatment, have to discover that it isn't all of our own doing, that there's no reason to be ashamed of me for being alive. In fact, I'm precious and valuable and priceless as a person. Well, if you have that with all addictions, you have it in spades with many people who are in the sexual minority community. So one of the key issues to deal with is to uncover the shame at a pace in which they can tolerate it and to address it without shaming further. Do you think that party drugs or social drugs contribute to the alleviation of shame? Or alcohol? No? Yes? No? I'm seeing yes, I'm seeing no. It does both, really, doesn't it? The short term, it alleviates the feeling, the experience of the shame. Longer term, it contributes to it because people then feel ashamed often of what they've done or what they're doing to their bodies. How they feel about themselves after they've come down from a weekend binge that was meant to stop Saturday morning, and gosh, they didn't make it to work until Tuesday at noon. And then find out that they're probably going to lose their job because it's the fifth time it's happened in 6 weeks. So there's that self-shaming that arises as well. Do any of you have any problems with any of those questions? Any questions about any of those questions? About why they're asked? How many of you ask a client, how many of you can spot a lesbian when she walks in the door? The truth is, I've been gay a long time. And I think my gaydar is really good. And I'm surprised at the number of times that I've got it wrong. And it could be I'm just a failure at this. But professionally, I often don't know. So I've learned to ask all clients when I'm doing an initial interview what their first sexual experience was, what it was, and what their sexual orientation is. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting when you get Mr. and Mrs. Wealthy Chelsea, Lone Rangers couple, in your office, and he says, I think we should have individual appointments before we meet again as a couple. And she agrees that would be a good idea so I can get more detailed information. And the first thing out of his mouth at the next visit is, I'm gay. And I'm struggling and I don't know what to do. And I drink too much and it's killing my marriage, and I love my wife tremendously and I love our kids. And I'm scared to death and I have no idea what to do. He's not out on the gay scene, officially. But he's making contacts. He travels. He's a banker, right? I'm making this up. I don't know. Lots of people travel. This one's a banker, say. So he goes to Hong Kong and he goes to New York City. And what does he do? Does he have boyfriends in his towns? How would you meet them long term? What do straight men do who travel?
Same thing.
Girlfriends in towns, or do they use prostitutes? By and large, they're going to use prostitutes because they're available. And what is one of the things, if you look on, I don't know, I've been in a phone booth in London in about 5 years, but are they still plastered with sex ads?
Yeah.
Okay. Almost any of those whom you call, you can get your drugs delivered by them at the same time. And the sex addicts I've worked with have really put me onto this, both the ones who are recovering from sex addiction as prostitutes, and those who are recovering from it as patrons, as Johns. The prostitute will often ask the client, especially if it's one she knows, if it's a female prostitute, and the same with my gay clients who use rent boys, do you want me to bring some coke? Now, why would they want to know if they might want coke?
Vasoconstrictor.
Well,
Makes the veins expand.
actually, it's a vasodilator down there, and the veins open, and they just you can't get an erection. So they get a night at 500, 700, 1,000 quid for spending the night with Joe Banker, or Joe Insurance Investment Person, and they don't have to put out any sex because he can't get it off. And they've made money off the coke. And the funny thing is, most of my guys that I worked with who were sex addicts who've gotten into this one time or another know it. They know it. Most of these, by the way, are straight. But the principle also holds for my gay clients who've been into this kind of situation. They don't socialize with gay people. They're uncomfortable with it. They themselves are gay. They often don't want other people to know that they're gay, except their therapist or maybe their GP and their psychiatrist. And 50% of the work is working with them to feel comfortable about being gay. But they are so deeply in their closets that they continue to engage in unsafe sex with prostitutes and feel shame about what? Okay. About using the drugs. They feel shame about using another human being for their sexual pleasure, or lack thereof. And most of them will tell you what they really wanted was some kind of companionship with a little sex thrown in on the side, and they really got neither because they were so off their face on the drug. I'm talking about clinical population. When I say clinical, I mean people that I see in my office or have seen, people, those of you who work in this field will see. Understand, this cannot be generalized to lesbian people, gay people, transgendered and bisexual people, and queers as a whole. We're talking about those that actually show up in our space. We'll see these patterns. But there's a lot of people who don't show up in our space. And aside from, so what did we come up with? We've come up with social acceptance in dealing with social unease. We've come up with another sort of contribution the drugs make is it makes sexual encounters, the setting up of them at least, easier, and it disinhibits. What else do drugs do and alcohol do? Numbing emotional pain, not necessarily just shame. Numbing emotional pain. And depression, obviously, is part of that. Depression. Can you think of anything else? I have my handy with the list. So here's some research that was done in the UK about 2 years ago. They found about 4 or 5 areas that seem to be most germane to this population. And the survey was done not of women, but of gay men who were willing to be interviewed. So one of those was managing social unease. Second one was alleviating loneliness and unhappiness. They can be more social in that kind of, if they're using. They're less inhibited. And they feel that they're making connections with people. So that was one of the second factors. The third was enabling sexual encounters. Drugs and alcohol help people in enabling sexual encounters and in having dates, first dates, for example. Or in some cases, although it wasn't addressed in research, I've had clients who were addicted to internet sexual activity who would have to get drunk or be high, some of them slamming crystal meth. They would do this before they logged on so they could feel like they could perform and that they were powerful and they were sexy. So in an odd way, it even enabled their sexual encounters. The fourth area was that there are gay norms. Remember at the beginning of this, I mentioned that, or at some point earlier, I mentioned that the British norm for drinking behavior is quite different to what's accepted as normal in the US. It's much lower there, it's seen differently. And that's a social construction. It's a social construct. But there are gay norms of alcohol and drug use. So one of the things you do if you're in any kind of group, you tend to you have affiliation with other people. you tend to want to affiliate with them in the ways that in which you understand they affiliate with one another. Does that make sense? So I'm gay, you're gay, I want to do what you do so that I can fit in somehow with you. So one of the norms of that is going out on Monday night. Every Monday night I go out to my local gay club and pub in East London. I still have to get this straight between pubs, clubs, and bars. I go out to my local gay pub in East London somewhere and meet up with my mates who are all recovering from the weekend, and we're sort of having a late tail of the dog, the hair of the dog, sorry. And we get together and we socialize, and that's my friendly start to the week with my mates. And then I go home and I go to bed, and then I go back to work, and I work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I come into town. I come into Soho to socialize with people that I usually socialize with on the weekend. And even if I don't do drugs, chances are I'm going to be socializing by drinking. And they drink a lot, and they drink until 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., and so I do too. Now, I may drink slower, I may drink less, I may drink more, but I tend to fit in. My behavior follows what my group's behavior tends to be. You see how that operates? The same is true if I'm in the club scene on the weekends. Bank holidays, people don't get back to work till Wednesday sometimes. They start partying on Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. Well, Monday's a holiday anyway, so I might as well go out and finish it off tonight. And then Tuesday is spent sleeping it off, and on Wednesday they show up to work if they have a job left. Another way of fitting in socially is for people who work in gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer settings, be those pubs, be those magazines, be those clothing stores. There are certain social norms that the social norms are dictated within that. Just like if you work at a company, if you work at Google, there are going to be certain ways that everybody kind of socializes together. Do you know what I mean? You have certain patterns. You all play frisbee on the lawn at 2 o'clock or something in the afternoon for a break. I don't know. But this drinking and drugging behavior often is associated with that kind of dynamic. It's simply about fitting in, and it's unconscious. You just do it because it's kind of what everybody does. And you don't do it necessarily having a problem. Remember, lots of people are able to do this for years and don't have a problem. Unfortunately, that's not true for everyone. And lots of people do have a problem. Now, the fifth area was summary, so we won't go into that. But can you think of another way in which drugs and alcohol would have a particular impact with sexual minorities? One of the key issues is that in recovery, or in treatment and intervention, is that we don't know what to do with these people should they get clean and sober. So they'll go into a traditional treatment center, treatment program, no offense to LifeWorks, or anyone else. But what do they do when they leave? They're told to go to 12-step meetings. And what's unique for gay people is that there aren't a lot of social situations or recovering social situations for gay, lesbian, anyone in the sexual minority to go to where they genuinely can feel comfortable with their identity as a gay person.
So to extrapolate out, you are suggesting that if you're gay, that drugs are more central to your social scene than if you're heterosexual. There are less options.
That may be true. I don't know that there's evidence for that. I don't mean to be. What I'm suggesting is that when I come out of LifeWorks after my treatment there, my successful treatment there, and I return to my community, I've been told and I've learned to stay away from people, places, and things that are likely to put me at risk, likely to trigger me. So then where do I find people to socialize with? How do I meet my old friends? Where do I go to make social connections with people? It's actually a little bit easier in London, and maybe down on the coast even, if you're Brighton Hove. But if you're going, I'm sorry to pick on Rotherham, I've never been there, it just popped into my head. If you live in Rotherham, there may not be this vast community, there may be 1 or 2 gay pubs.
Just those comments of difficulty of getting into relationships, that's a common one, I think, in anyone in recovery. I hear a lot of that as well.
But not just social, not just intimate relationships, but social relationships. You see, you lose because these people have been your peer group and your support system, however negative that's been for you. And there is a fairly strong, in my opinion at least, a fairly strong 12-step community here with some specific programs for members of those groups where they will be accepted. But one of the ongoing complaints that gay people have from these studies who have tried recovery and may have succeeded, may not have done, is that they go to meetings and they feel judged. You know, they would like to be able to go to a 12-step meeting and say, I ran into my old boyfriend and he said to me, one of the things I need to say is many gay men are very, in my experience, are very open about their sexuality. Especially if we've come out of the closet, we can tend to be quite open. And one of the things we may do is we may talk in ways that our straight counterparts might not do. Would you disagree with that? Or so we can be very frank and blunt. So I've had clients, for example, who have come out who might go to a 12-step meeting. And I remember one who said, I really wanted you, my ex-boyfriend, when I came out of treatment, just kind of because I wanted to let him know I was clean and sober and I felt good about it. And he turned me down and I felt like, and I don't know what to do. And his cock was the most beautiful I've ever seen. And, you know, he's going to a meeting in Lavender Hill. He's probably not going to be very well received. And yet, so he may be told to try to tone down his language, try to do this or try to do that. There's a lot of experience that's reported by gay men. I'm only talking about gay men because that's where the research I'm familiar with in this particular area. A lot of the research suggests that they're quite uncomfortable because they cannot be open about their sexual experience and the core of it to their lives. You see, one of the things that's debated, will be debated endlessly, is what does sexual orientation mean to the person who has it? Straight men don't tend to go around thinking, I'm straight, I'm straight, I'm straight. Do you understand that?
Yeah.
Having worked with thousands of gay men, I mean straight men, I can promise you, they don't generally go around thinking about it. Gay men have been marginalized as children, as adolescents, as young adults, as older adults. So we do tend, our sexuality becomes a core, a key part of our outward open identity to ourselves. It's not something that's kind of concealed and just natural. Gay men are raised in straight culture, in straight dominant culture. Lesbian women are raised in straight dominantly straight culture. So because we're in a different role, we have a different experience. And it's core to many, many gay men. And I suspect that anyone who's dealt with this, I've worked with some transgender folks of both sexes who really felt the brunt of it because they would get seemingly innocent comments made by people who wanted to be accepting and were just quite judgmental of their very nature because, oh, you're going to have surgery, why are you doing that? Why are you having your face fixed? You're feminine enough already. You've already had the bits down there done, why do you want to get your face done now? And there's not a sense of what appearance and what understanding means to that individual. Because for most people, it's just a natural part of their growing up, their sexual orientation, they don't give it a second thought. But for people who are of a different orientation, it's often a key component of their experience in the system. Remember, we've all been to meetings, I'm sure. Those of us who've gone to meetings have been to meetings where we found this meeting, I can't believe this meeting runs this way. I can't believe it. Look at all the crosstalk that goes on, or look at how they went up to that guy afterwards and told him to please shut up and not to say those kinds of things in this meeting. We've all done that. I mean, here in the US and Canada, I've been to a lot of meetings in my life, and those things happen. But imagine you're fresh and new to recovery. People often get turned off in a very big way, and I'm sorry that so do straight people, I'm sure, by going to a 12-step meeting where they feel judged or like they can't be open. It's scary enough to even be in the room, and then they go to one where they can't be open. It's a different experience to go to an NA meeting on Friday night in Soho, in Covent Garden, where everybody's gay, although the complaints I hear about those are that they're cliquish. And I'd like to say that there are no cliquish meetings in 12-step programs, but I've been to too many that were of all sorts, here in the US and so on. So there's always going to be the complaining people. But I think in this case, there's an issue. We're talking about recovery. 12-step programs may not be the friendliest place for them to go to gain social support. And the social support they want is not to be divorced from their own community entirely.
from my experience and what I've learned, most of the people who come out of treatment don't understand what makes them an addict. They come out of treatment looking to try and fix themselves and attend meetings, as opposed to coming out with understanding what their actual illness is. They're given a load of tasks when they leave.
Given
A lot of tasks when they leave. Go to the meeting, do this. So their inability to socially adapt or becomes more difficult, because if you're in a smaller community like a gay community, and then you're in the recovery gay community, it's even smaller again, as opposed to understanding what their illness is and dealing with their illness with the general society. Can you see where I'm going with that one?
Oh, I see completely.
Thank you.
I also have to say, and I'm probably, there will be people who will never speak to me again and I will never hear from you. 12-step programs are not for everyone. And having been in one or another for 35 plus years of my life, I believe that's true. And there are highly judgmental people in 12-step programs. And the last thing a newly recovering lesbian needs is to be judged, or to have someone crack a faggot joke or a lesbo joke at the end of the meeting or in private, or you're not so bad for a lessie. Or, I mean, I've heard all sorts of things that make my, well, I lost my hair, you can see why. People are not necessarily sensitive and idealistic in 12-step programs, and that's fine, they need to be. The point is, and the problem is, that that's about all that exists. And even in the meeting, I've had clients that have gone to some meetings that were primarily gay, or lesbian oriented, or sexual minority oriented, who would never go back because of the way they were treated at the door. Okay, because you had, pardon the expression, I've been around long enough to do this. You had Miss Queen, who made a comment about your shoes, and didn't mean anything by it. But they're 3 days out of treatment center, and they're just like, oh, I don't need this. I don't need this right now. And I've had them come to my office in tears because this isn't what they needed. And what can you offer me? Because it's either that, I have to put up with this stuff by a meeting that's supposed to be of my people, or I'm back in the clubs on the weekends. And so what you'll see is they'll stay away from the clubs and their friends for 2 or 3 months, and then their friends start calling and saying, hey, we never see you around anymore. Aren't we your mates anymore? Why don't you come to lunch or dinner? At least we can meet up that way. And pretty soon then they're back at their place on the weekend, and then one night they're there and they finally say, oh hell, it's been 4 months, I'll have a glass of red wine with you. And they aren't an alcoholic, so they have a glass of wine and it's fine. And they go back to the following weekend and they have 2. And at the end of the second glass, one of the mates pulls out a bump of MDMA and says, oh come on, we're going, come with this dancing. And you say, the guy says, no, and he's, oh come on. It's just one little bump, you're not going to use it anymore tonight, we'll watch you and take care of you. And they go, and 3 weeks later, what's happening? On Tuesday, they're in a profound depression. They can't go to work all week. They lose their job. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing here, but it's difficult in any situation when there aren't a lot of alternative social opportunities for people to interact. And since social interaction, in other words, the loneliness part doesn't get addressed, post-recovery, it's one of the key issues that we have to face. And you can start, I mean, I've done gay men's support groups in the States. And the problem is not everybody in a group gets along either, you know. But at least in a group, you have a way of people kind of, the peers, taking care of one another a bit. But it is a real problem. I didn't say I'd have solutions tonight to all of these problems. I don't. But it is a real problem, and it's an issue that needs to be looked at. And if any of you have really good ideas about some way to do this, I'd certainly like to know. There's an ongoing debate, I think, in what treatment offers versus what it doesn't offer. And different programs offer different things. So there's traditionally been a big focus on behavior change, but it doesn't do much probably for people that need an attitude change as well. So I think more recently treatment programs are incorporating things like finding your shame core and addressing it. But I can tell you, if you're coming out and you're feeling pretty wobbly and you go to the first 5 meetings you go to, 3 of the people comment that, oh, you must be a faggot. But we like faggots in our meetings, so welcome. That may just freak you out. You may never come back. It's tough. And life is hard, you know. So, but the point is that 12-step meetings don't work for everyone anyway. They work for a lot of us, but they don't work for everyone. Each community, just like each individual, is going to have things that are unique to it, however. And these things that I'm talking about with regard to meetings are simply reports of what I've heard from clients and friends in some cases about their experience in 12-step meetings. I've also heard them from plenty of straight clients. You know. I mean, I've gone to, do you know Brixton Sunday afternoon, Sunday meeting, the beginning? I take clients there from time to time. And they're always blown away that there'd be this many people on the 12-step meeting. And they feel more comfortable because there's so many people. But they don't want to go back because there's so many weirdos. We can all find excuses not to go to meetings, right, if we want to. The other thing I want to say is that considering that there is fairly low compliance among members of sexual minorities with attendance at 12-step programs, and we know this to be true from, there's been plenty of research, not just in the UK but in the US. However friendly you may want them to be, and however sexual minorities specifically you might want them to be, but maybe we may need to look at and explore some new ways of thinking about something, which is, for gay men anyway, they may have to reintegrate as sober people into the existing culture, subculture. And we may have to find ways to empower them to do that. Does that make sense? So it may be that they can't handle staying clean and not going and just going to AA meetings or NA meetings or another 12-step meeting. It may be that some of them can learn and may need to learn, or may have learned on their own, that they still can go to the places they used to go with some of the friends they used to go with, and that they simply are, from a strengths perspective, get experience in being able to say, God, I hate to say this because it sounds so Nancy Reagan, but to say no, I don't do that anymore, but I want to be here dancing tonight with all of you. We may need to find some empowerment models or create them. And it's risky, but the alternative to this, I see golden eyes.
I mean, I go sometimes, probably alone.
Sure. But in terms of having be part of an extended recovery program, it may be something that maybe the gay community itself and the gay recovery community needs to look at. But I think what doesn't go down well with particularly young people who are really struggling with this is to say, it's one thing to say I can never do drugs again. It's a little worse to say I can never drink alcohol again. What's really bad is to say I can never be with my friends again out on the scene. Because not everyone who goes on the scene, whatever that scene may be, is doing drugs and alcohol. I mean, I see lots of people drinking Diet Coke or water. There is increasing evidence that there are ways in which people, gay men in particular certainly, but people in general, but I happen to have the research on gay men, do engage in controlled use. They have a problem or are developing one. They get treatment, they pull back, and then they experiment for a while to see what they think they can manage. And many of them seem to be able to manage for years, a number of years. However, there are no valid, reliable, clear longitudinal studies to tell us whether it really works or not. But I think the reality is a lot of people are moving towards and trying to gain controlled use. So I guess my take on that, having been doing this for so long, is I try to support them if that's what they think they're going to do, because guess what? I can't control what they do anyway. So I'll support them in doing that, but I'll also point out that they seem to be slipping back into other patterns, because I think many people are addicted. Some people just abuse and then go through a period of that and return. So our time is nearly up. It's about 8:30. That's 8:35. So any more questions? I think we have to be out in about 25 minutes. Thank you all for coming.